Okay, well, these are strange times, and guess I'm looking forward to seeing how this all works. I'm doing this from my apartment. You know, one of my favorite novels is Marquez's Love in the Time of Cholera. So this is the Grundrisse in the time of COVID-19, which seems a little bit bizarre, but on the other hand, you know, there's the long run and the short run, and the long run, I think the Grundrisse will prevail. The last time we, in a sense, finished up one phase of the Grundrisse, which is summarized by the final kind of comment on page 514, which is where we ended up last time, which is saying that we have seen the true nature of capital. And much of what Marx has been trying to do, I think, up until this point, has been to define what capital is and how we should understand the concept. And of course, Marx's understanding is dialectical, and it is a very strong argument to differentiate the way in which Marx understands capital from the way in which conventional economists would understand capital, or even in daily life we would understand capital. And I think the central issue here is this idea that capital does not exist outside of labor. And what's more, it does not exist outside of alienated labor. And it is alienated labor and alienated capital which, in a sense, define each other, and each tries to complete itself within the other, and they're locked in this kind of battle, which, in a sense, can be understood as class struggle, which would be two forces which are outside of each other and colliding. But that's not how Marx sees it. Marx sees it as actually two forces inside of capital which are struggling with each other. And I was trying to think of literary ways to think about this comparison. And the best one I can come up with is Conan Doyle's story of the relationship between Sherlock Holmes and the Napoleon of crime, as he was called, Moriarty. And Conan Doyle, I think, was tired of having to write stories about Sherlock Holmes and wanted to somehow or other get rid of him and kill him off, if you like. It's like, you know, in one of these episodes, if you kill off the main character, then the episode is in effect over. And he did this in a short story which had him cast against this figure, Moriarty. And it ends with a sort of pursuit across Europe of Sherlock Holmes finally catching up with Moriarty, and both of them are on the edge of this gorge, Rauschenberg or whatever it was, gorge in Bavaria, and they struggle with each other, and the end of the story has both of them locked in a mortal embrace, going off the cliff edge into the gorge in beneath. And in a sense, I think what Marx is trying to do is to say to us that we should think about capital and labor as defining each other, locked in a mortal embrace, and the end of one would be the end of the other. And therefore, whatever we're doing, we just cannot get rid of capital without getting rid of alienated labor, and we cannot get rid of alienated labor without getting rid of alienated capital. And so that is, if you like, a certain consciousness that arises. And Marx, as you will recall, started to talk about recognition and consciousness on the part of the reader that this is what we were dealing with. So that, if you like, is what the true nature of capital is being depicted in the Grundrisse. And we're now moving, however, into a kind of a series of questions as to how the nature of capital actually works. And so this week we're going to deal with that in a very, very specific way, which is in some ways, I think, rather exciting, because Marx wants to talk about the circulation of capital and the way in which capital moves around and how it moves. And I will come back and wave my familiar kind of diagram at you, which is about the way in which capital circulates, starting with the money at the bottom, moving up through the moment of production, then going through realization and monetization, and then going to distribution, and then coming back in again. So this is the circulation process of capital. And Marx in this section wants to look at that whole circulation process and to do it in a way where we all understand some of the impacts this circulation has on what is going on around us in terms of daily life. Marx starts off by kind of saying that he had earlier discussed, way back in the beginning of the Grundrisse, the question of money and the circulation of money. Money circulates in relationship to commodity exchange. It's the inverse movement to commodity exchange. The money does not disappear. It remains within the system and continues to circulate on a permanent kind of basis. And that raises all kinds of questions that we looked at the very beginning of the Grundrisse, which, okay, how much of this money do you need to circulate an expanding mass of commodities, things of that sort. And Marx deals with that. But now we're looking at the circulation of capital. And the circulation of capital, of course, grabs onto the money circulation at a certain point, and it becomes a form of money circulation. You start in that diagram I showed you with money, which then becomes money capital. Money capital then comes back in again once you monetize the commodities after production, and then that flows back again. So we're now talking about the circulation of money capital. And Marx starts to kind of say, well, whereas money circulation goes all over the place, money capital circulates in a way which is structured along the lines that are pointed out here. And as it structures, so it starts to sort of infiltrate the world of monetary circulation and starts to discipline the monetary circulation to the point where the circulation of money in society is dominated by the circulation, the monetary form of capital circulation. So that, again, this is one of these things where Marx is kind of saying, all right, money existed before capital, money enters in and starts to gnaw away at the edges of capital, and bit by bit, capital starts to sort of dominate the monetary circulation. So he starts off with this by saying that the circulation of capital, he says on 516, constantly ignites itself anew, that is, it comes round in the circulation, divides into its different moments, and is a perpetuum mobile, that is, its continuous process of movement. And then he kind of points out, as he's done before, that in its circulation, capital expands itself in its path. This is the argument about the endless accumulation of capital and the endless expansion of capital. And then he introduces something which has been hinted at before, but which isn't specifically being considered, which is the speed or slowness of its circulation. And that, he says, forms one of its intrinsic moments. It becomes qualitatively altered in circulation, and the totality of the moments of its circulation are themselves the moments of its production, its reproduction as well as its new production. Now, there are two things being produced here. One is you're producing capital and reproducing capital, but you're also producing the effect of speed and of movement, because after all, capital is defined as a process, is defined as a process of money in motion and value in motion. So this is what is posited, he says, on 517, by alien capital, and hence again by capital, so that the circulation of value, of money capital, starts to grab hold of not only the one capital, but the circulation of many capitals. And so what we're now going to start to look at is the circulation of monetary forms and money capital in relationship to many different forms of capital, different industries, some of which are supplying means of production to other industries and the like. So we're going to look at the circulation of capital in general. And as he says on bottom of 517, the circulation of money itself, which is the initial starting point, now appears as determined by the circulation of capital. And it is the circulation of capital which he's going to be looking at. Within this circulation process, there is, as he says, at the bottom of 517, he introduces this idea that he's going to look very much at production, which we've been analyzing right up until this point, but we're now also going to look at how production integrates with circulation in general. We're not just talking here now about a particular form of circulation. We're talking about the circulation of this whole process through production, realization, distribution, and then we're coming back into the circle. And then he introduces the kind of question: how long capital remains within the sphere of the production process depends on the latter's technological conditions. And the time it spends in this phase directly coincides, even though the duration is necessarily different, depending upon the type of production, with the development of the productive forces. That is, the technological change is going to affect the speed with which the production process works, and that speed is therefore going to be dependent upon the technology. And he takes this up again on page 518, where he says the speed with which it can repeat the production process anew is at the same time determined by the development of the productive forces in all other branches of industry. This becomes quite clear if one supposes the same capital to produce its own raw materials, instruments, and final products. The length of time during which capital remains in the phase of the production process becomes itself a moment of circulation. And what Marx is doing here is saying, okay, now let's reintegrate production into this whole kind of circular process of movement. And so we're going to look at the circulation process of capital as a whole, and production is just one moment within that process. And that one moment takes up a certain amount of time. And the question then is, how much time does it take up? How quickly can you go through it so that you can come back into circulation? That is, we not only have to look at the technology, but also if all of the other moments in the circulation process run frictionless, then how many times can you conduct this form of production again and again and again? And that depends on the technology, but it also depends upon the availability of all the raw materials. It depends on the availability of the fixed capital, the availability of the raw materials, so that the second part of this circulation process is not only how long do you spend in the production process itself, but how much time do you take to complete the transformation of capital into its different forms of commodity, money, and the like. And this leads him to take up on 519 what he calls the velocity of turnover. Now, Marx uses turnover time, and it is introduced here, but not really worked out very well. But this is a very important argument in volume 2 of Capital. That is, the turnover time of capital is how long it takes you to start from the money capital to get back to the money capital. And that turnover time can accelerate, and then it also depends on how fast you can go through the moment of sale of the commodity, the distribution, and all the rest of it. And the velocity of turnover has some very important implications. One of the problems is that, of course, different capitals have different turnover times. When you're working in agriculture, and he introduces this on the bottom of 519, when you look at agriculture, you're on an annual turnover basis for the most part, unless you're in that part of the world where you can do double cropping. But for most of the agriculture, you get it once a year. So that's your turnover time. But if you're making ice cream or you're making something else, what's the turnover time? The turnover time can be much shorter. Other kinds of commodities, the turnover time would be much longer. If, for example, you're growing pears, something like that, the pear tree takes a long time to mature. So the turnover time in pear production in agriculture is different from the turnover time of wheat production. So you start to have to confront the fact that there are these multiple turnover times of different spheres of production. And the big problem then arises is, how do you coordinate all of these different turnover times? And for instance, the turnover time in the production of cotton cloth is continuous. On the other hand, the input of the cotton, if there's only one harvest once a year, comes once a year. So you've got these two different turnover times. How does capital negotiate these different turnover times? And this then leads him to look at one of the problems that arises, because there are moments in this process where maybe nothing is happening. For example, you put seed in the soil and nothing happens for quite a while. There's no labor being added to it at all. And you just wait for it to grow, and then it grows and grows and grows. And then maybe some labor comes along with, weed it or put pesticides or whatever it is the farmers want to do for a little bit. So a bit more labor will be put in. But the main labor then comes from seeding and then harvesting. In between, there's a lot of dead time. So Marx introduces the idea that in any production process, there are likely to be moments when nothing is happening. And if nothing is happening, that means that you're actually losing value. So he suggests that we have to introduce into this whole process the idea of devaluation. That capital, which is just sitting, waiting for the seed to sprout and to grow, is not really doing anything. It is technically devalued. So he starts to talk about the fact that in this whole kind of process of movement of valuation through the system, there are these times and phases of nothing happening, and they are times and phases, he says, which should be thought of as devaluation. So the duration then of the production process of capital is one thing, but then there's also the duration of the circulation process. How long does it take you to get from having produced the corn to getting the money back for the corn? And then you've got to take the corn to market. That takes a little time. It may stay on the market for some time. If the corn is going to have to be ground into cornmeal, it's going to take even more time. And so the whole kind of question then arises as to the different temporalities which are involved in the circulation process and how general the circulation process is. And so he says, okay, I'm going to look at the circulation process with production as one moment that takes a certain amount of time. I then have to look at marketing, which is going to take some more time. And I'm going to look at the utilization of what is being marketed, maybe in other forms. That's going to take even more time. So I'm going to look at all these temporalities and how they fit together. But his main concentration in this chapter is on the realization of the value produced in the market. How much time does it take to realize the value? And this is then going to be about how much time is going to be taken up with the act of marketing. I mean, it would be very nice if the moment you produce the corn, it was instantaneously marketed. That doesn't happen. there is a temporality involved in this, and this is what he's going to look at. And this turns out to be a bit problematic. He kind of says, well, one of the things we have to recognize is that actually when you're marketing the product, you have to get the product to market, and it may take you some time to get the product to market. And that how much time it takes you to get the product to market is a function of, quote, the greater distance of the market in space, and hence the delayed return. The longer time required by capital to realize itself would be due here to the greater spatial distance it has to travel after the production process in order to exchange. Cannot, he says, the product produced for China be regarded in such a way that the product is completed, its production process completed, only when it has reached the Chinese market. Its realization costs would rise by the cost of transport from England to China. The cost of production, then he then said, would resolve into the labor time objectified in the direct production process, plus the labor time contained in transport. So we've now got to come up with the question: does transport add value? Will there be value added through the transport? And Marx's answer to that is, well, yes. His answer is that actually the product is not finished until it is actually at the marketplace. So the fact that you make it in place A is not necessarily the end of the product. It is not completed until it's got from point A, where it's made, to point B, where it is going to be sold. So the cost of transportation adds to the value of the commodity. Now, this can lead to some confusions, because Marx's general argument is going to be that value cannot be created from circulation per se. That is, from the activities of the merchant capitalists do not create value. The activities of the retailers do not create value. But this, he says, is different from the transportation, so that a certain amount of value will be created during the process of circulation, provided it's about producing something which is quite simply logged in as change of location. You produce a material change of location, that adds value. On the other hand, providing sort of value to the merchant for their acting as intermediary does not create value. The value that they command is a deduction out of the value which was created in production. So, but transport and communications and movement over space is going to be very different. Now, of course, as a geographer, I like all of this because it's about the spatialization of the circulation process and the fact that value is created out of creating change of location. And which then leads, of course, to saying, well, okay, if labor is involved in producing the change of location, can surplus value be extracted from the transport costs? And again, Marx's argument is, well, yes, to the degree that the transport is set up as a material kind of process, and it employs labor. Laborers will be paid the value of their labor power, and they may produce more change of location, and the value of the change of location may be greater than that labor power, and therefore surplus value can be extracted from the transport and communications industries. So this is where we start on this analysis. But this also applies not only to the flow of commodities going from what I have produced to how it's got to market. It also applies to my inputs. That is, when I'm buying raw materials, as he says on 523, whether I extract metals from mines or take commodities to the site of their consumption, both movements are equally spatial. The improvement of the means of transport and communication likewise falls into the category of the development of the productive forces generally. Okay, here's another interesting thing. Productive forces, that is technological changes, are going to be very important in the transport and communication sector. And here he's kind of saying that to the degree that transportation and change of location is productive of value, no matter whether it's the inputs or the outputs, how much it is going to be productive of value depends upon the productive forces which are deployed in the transport and communication sector. Now, this is not a minor problem. This is actually foundational for the history of capital. How many innovations are really about revolutionizing the productive forces which are actually able to create a change of location? Well, innovation in the transport and communication sector has been crucially important in the whole history of capitalism, and here Marx is kind of explaining why that is the case. This is the argument then, which is to say that an additional moment enters in, he says on 524, to the value production, which is the costs of circulation, which are not contained in the simple concept of circulation. And these costs are as was the case with the means of transport and communication. And in this next moment, we're going to look at the circulation costs which exist in general. And these are different from transport and communications because they do not add value, but they are what he calls the necessary costs of circulation. And these necessary costs of circulation are going to be deductions out of the value which is already being produced by what happens in production and what happens in transportation. So, but again, the means of communication and transport are very different. And Marx is saying this is a very important aspect of what is going on in a capitalist economy. So 524 towards the bottom, he says, the more production comes to a rest on exchange value, hence on exchange, the more important are the physical conditions of exchange, the means of communication and transport, become for the costs of circulation. Capital, by its nature, drives beyond every spatial barrier. Thus, the creation and the physical conditions of exchange, of the means of communication and transport, the annihilation of space by time, becomes an extraordinary necessity for it. Only insofar as the direct product can be realized in distant markets in mass quantities in proportions to reductions in the transportation costs, and only insofar as at the same time the means of communication and transport themselves can yield spheres of realization for labor driven by capital, only insofar as commercial traffic takes place in massive volumes, in which more than necessary labor is replaced, only to that extent is the production of cheap means of communication and transport a condition for production based on capital and promoted by it for that reason. There's an interesting phrase here, which I've often worked with a lot in my own work, which is the annihilation of space by time. I've always found it a bit odd, that this phrase, the annihilation of space by time. It suggests that time actually itself annihilates space, and it always seemed a bit odd. And so I asked a couple of times, is this a correct translation? And it turns out that that is not exactly a correct translation. That the proper translation would be the annihilation of space through time. And we'll see another rendition of the translation later on. So it's not annihilation of space by time, it is the annihilation of space through time. And it's going to be through time because time is the measure of value. And the big question is not space itself, but how fast you can move over to space. How much time does it take you to get from A to B? And so the number of miles doesn't matter. It's how how many minutes or hours it takes you to traverse those miles that matters. So when we say the annihilation of space through time, we kind of say, really, the measure of space is how long it takes you to traverse that space. And that how long to traverse it is what it is that many revolutions in technologies are really all about. And so that is where we're headed here. Not annihilation of space by time, but the measure of space and space relation being how much time does it take you, or how much does it cost you to traverse the space. So that's what we're going to be looking at here. And now, in order to do this, then we have to start to look at how it is that production based on capital is so attached to the idea of this annihilation of space through time, the reduction of the time it takes you to move from A to B. And of course, it doesn't take too much to recognize that a lot of the innovations in the history of capital are about reducing space to less and less time of movement. But this is, he says, all labor required in order to throw the finished product into circulation. It is in economic circulation only when it is present on the market, is from capital's viewpoint a barrier to be overcome. That is, spatial friction is a barrier, the barrier of overcoming space, and that therefore we have to find capital has to find ways to overcome this barrier. And then he immediately kind of comes up with the question of, well, highways originally fall to the community, later for a long period to the governments as pure deductions from production, deducted from the common surplus product of the country. But it is held they do not constitute a source of wealth in themselves, even though they are important for the possibility of reducing the barriers of spatial distance. And so we then get into an extended discussion on road construction. Who builds the road? Why is the road built? What is the purpose of the road, and what is happening with the road? And that all takes place on 525. And then there's kind of interesting question as to whether the capitalist or the state builds the road. And does the capitalist make a gain here then? And we have a discussion about, can you buy and sell the road? And then he says, first, strip off what is puzzling about the road, which arises from its nature as fixed capital. Imagine that the road could be sold at once, like a coat or a ton of iron, he says, in which case we would start to get a lengthy discussion which follows over the question of road building. But I would suggest that you read this not simply about road building. What Marx is posing here is the whole kind of question of the production of physical infrastructures. Who is going to be responsible? What is their role? Do they actually produce value, or do they create conditions in which value can be created by, say, trucks going over highways, of uses of the physical infrastructures? And so Marx then kind of gets into the question, well, okay, who builds the road? If it's a communal project, then it's built in a certain way. If it's built in another way by the state, and are there possibilities for it to be built by capital? And then the question arises as, who needs the road, and by what means is the need of a road communicated in such a way that a road actually gets built, and how the infrastructures actually get built? Now, I'm not going to argue that these passages here solve all of these kinds of questions, but for me at least, in terms of the production of physical infrastructures, the production of the built environment, the production of urbanization, all those kinds of questions, those questions are critical in terms of my own work. But here I find a framework in which I can start to plant kind of sort of questions about, well, okay, how does capital accumulation work in relationship to the production of these physical infrastructures? Who is going to produce those infrastructures? Is it going to be the state? Is it going to be the commune? Is it going to be capital? And where are the needs coming from, and how are the needs registered? And I'll come back to that in a little bit. And he has also, however, a serious point that these physical infrastructures take very considerable concentration of raw materials and productive capacity. Now that can take place, of course, through the agency of the state, but it's possible also for them to be taken through the concentrations of capital. And of course, in Marx's time, we see the concentrations of capital coming up in terms of the joint stock companies that were building the railroads, which were building the infrastructures and so on. So we start to see some aspects of that. And then this also gets through into the question of what kind of labor is involved here, and is that labor being worked in a way which is contributing surplus value, and if so, how? So he sort of talks on 529 about a special class of road workers may form, employed by the state. Now we know that construction work is a very special kind of work, and here he's kind of saying, well, maybe we have to think about that special kind of work and the extraction of surplus value from this special kind of work. And then the question arises: can capital itself become concentrated enough, large scale enough, that it can undertake these kinds of enterprises on its own account? And then he kind of says, well, if capital becomes large enough, and as he says on 529, now for the capitalist to undertake road building as a business at his expense, various conditions are required, which all amount to this: that the mode of production based on capital is already developed to its highest stage. Firstly, large capital is itself presupposed, a large capital concentrated in his hands in order that he may be able to undertake work of such dimensions and of such slow turnover and hence realization. Because if you actually pay for the road, you're going to pay for it over, 15, 20 years. The realization process of the value of the road is quite problematic. Hence, he says, mostly share capital. The form in which capital has worked itself up to its final form in its substance, but is posited also in its form as social power and product. Secondly, it must bring interest. That is, almost certainly, if you're going to go into this, you're going to have to borrow a lot of funds from the shareholders, and they're going to want interest on the money they invest. And so somehow or other, interest is going to have to be paid. But interestingly, he says, not necessarily profit. That is, when the return of capital is divided into interest and profit, maybe when you're investing in the infrastructures, you don't need to get the profit, which will be taken up later on. Thirdly, as presuppositions, such a volume of traffic, commercial above all, that the road pays for itself. Now, obviously, what Marx has in mind here is a toll road of some kind, which could pay for itself, but will depend on the volume of the traffic. And the same will be true of railroads and other infrastructures and so on. Fourthly, a portion of idle wealth which can lay out its revenues for these articles of locomotion. So not only do you need to build the road, but you need to build the trucks that go along it. You not only got to build the railroad, you got to build the locomotives which run on it. So these are or if you like, the necessities that exist before these large-scale projects of this kind can be actually handled by capital. And I think it's kind of interesting that over the last 30 or 40 years, larger and larger products have been financed by capital itself. The argument I would use would be the Channel Tunnel. In the 19th century, this would be the kind of thing that would be done and could only be done through the state apparatus. But the Channel Tunnel was set up with obviously state participation, state planning, but the financing was all private. It came from a consortium of banks, and they funded all of this. And there has to be a clear need for it. And Marx introduces his own example of this on the middle of 530. The first railway between Liverpool and Manchester had become a necessity of production for the Liverpool cotton brokers and even more for the Manchester manufacturers. Capital as such, it's being posited with a necessary scope, will produce roads only when the production of roads has become a necessity for the producers. That is, for the direct producers, in this case, for the cotton mills of Manchester and for the merchants in Liverpool. And so this, therefore, kind of says this was then created a condition for the capitalist profit making. That is, the railroad could be profitable because it was already indicated there was a trade there. But then something interesting happens, which Marx notices. When he at the bottom, he says, all general conditions of production, such as roads, canals, etc., whether they facilitate circulation or even make it possible at all, or whether they increase the force of production, that all of these presuppose, in order to be undertaken by capital instead of by the government, the highest development of production founded on capital. The separation of public works from the state and their migration into the domain of works undertaken by capital itself indicates the degree to which the real community has constituted itself in the form of capital. A country, for example, the United States, may feel the need for railways in connection with production. Nevertheless, the direct advantage arising from them for production may be too small for the investment to appear as anything but sunk capital. Then capital shifts the burden onto the shoulders of the state. Okay, so we've got a very interesting thing here about possibility of public-private partnerships, which of course Marx doesn't mention, but which we're going to take this kind of bridging things, and who bears the burden, what the form of capital is. But then Marx comes up with a kind of a very interesting observation, which turns out to have a great deal of historical truth to it. He says on the bottom, 531, capital undertakes only advantageous undertakings, advantageous in its sense. True, it also speculates unsoundly, and as we shall see, must do so. It then undertakes investments which do not pay, and which pay only as soon as they have become to a certain degree devalued. Hence, the many undertakings where the first investment is sunk and lost, the first entrepreneurs go bankrupt and begin to realize themselves only at second or third hand, where the invested capital has become smaller owing to devaluation. That is, the initial investors go in there, speculate, think they can make a killing out of something, go bankrupt, and then whatever they did is left behind, and along comes the second wave of capitalists and says, okay, I pick up these investments for almost nothing. They still have a use value, and that use value can then be deployed in such a way that the second wave or the third wave of investors coming in can make a profit. My example, which I think I mentioned before, was the London Underground system, that the initial tunnels were set up and large amounts of capital were mobilized, actually from the United States, to flow to London to build the underground system in London. The companies went bankrupt because they just couldn't sustain. All the investors actually many of them coming from Baltimore, by the way, from Maryland, in the late 19th, early 20th century, lost their money. And then the tunnels are sitting there, and along came another bunch of investors and said, okay, we'll take over the tunnels, and we'll pay, I don't know, £200 for all the network of tunnels, and then we'll lay the tracks and we'll get the stuff going. And then it turned out to be profitable. So, but there's a long history of this sort of thing, and we see it going on around us all of the time. But then he says something else which is important towards the bottom. The road itself may so increase the force of production that it creates new traffic, which then makes the road profitable. That is, you can invest in such a way as to meet an existing demand, or you can invest in such a way that you actually create the demand which validates what you have done. So a lot of these investments are of that sort. They look to create the demand. If the demand does not materialize, then what happens is that people go bankrupt, but then the next group comes in. So this is, I think, a very important digression, as Marx calls it, which is about infrastructure investments, how they're mobilized, whether they're mobilized by the state, how the need is expressed and what the need is about, and how needs are met, and how actually needs are created so that the investment actually creates the need rather than the need creating the investment. And so he concludes on 533. The result of our digression, and this has been a very interesting digression, I think, is incidentally that the production of the means of communication, of the physical conditions of circulation, is put into the category of the production of fixed capital. Interesting. So we're going to come up a lot with fixed capital, but this is, and hence does not constitute a special case. That the rules of fixed capital formation are going to be applied, but in a certain way. Meanwhile, and incidentally, they're opened us for the prospect, which cannot be sharply defined yet at this point, of a specific relation of capital to the communal general conditions of social production, as distinct from the conditions of particular capital and its particular production process. So Marx has opened up here, as I suggested at the beginning, the whole question of infrastructural investments and how they're organized. And this is something that he clearly sees needs to be paid attention to, but it's, down the line. But he then comes back after the digression, bottom of 533. Circulation proceeds in space and time. This is kind of the thing I love, as my geography hat coming on. Economically considered, the spatial condition, the bringing of the product to the market, belongs to the production process itself. The product is really finished only when it is on the market. This is the proposition he'd been earlier making, now he's asserting it more foundationally. The movement through which it gets there belongs still with the cost of making it. It does not form a necessary moment of circulation regarded as a particular value process. But this spatial moment is important insofar as the expansion of the market and the exchangeability of the product are connected with it. The reduction of the costs of the real circulation belongs to the development of the forces of production by capital, the reduction of the costs of its realization. The reduction of the costs of this real circulation, then, is something we really have to look at. This locational moment, he then says, middle of 534, the bringing of the product to market, which is a necessary condition of its circulation, except when the point of production is itself a market, could more precisely be regarded as the transformation of the product into a commodity. Only on the market is it a commodity. That is, it's not a commodity until it gets on the market, and getting it to market is part of its value. The abbreviation, he says, of this movement, of this moment, that is, of bringing it to market, is likewise development of productive force. However, this is time still conceived only as an external condition for the transition from the state of money into that of commodity. So it is the time taken which is important here. And this belongs to the cost of production. Quite different, he said, is the time which generally passes before the commodity makes its transition into money, or the time during which it remains a commodity, that is, on the shelf of the retailers or something, only a potential but not real value. This is pure loss. It is clear, he says, from everything said above, that circulation appears as an essential process of capital. The production process cannot be begun anew before the transformation of the commodity into money. The constant continuity of this process, the unobstructed and fluid transition of value from one form into the other, or from one phase of the process into the next, appears as a fundamental condition for production based on capital to a much greater degree than for all earlier forms of production. So, how the circulation process proceeds, how transport and communication work, how change of location is set up. This is all integrated into here. He then kind of says, look, there are problems here, and there are various ways in which capital is invented to deal with these problems. And he introduces on 535 the suspension of the chance element of all of this movement by capital itself. And that suspension is going to be the credit system. Now, we're way over our heads in the credit system when in here Marx introduces it. But he introduces it and said that this is one of the ways in which credit is going to have a very important role in dealing with the turnover time of capital and the different turnover times of capital. But he then kind of says, well, you know, the credit system and certainly usury has been around for a very long time, and then kind of ends up by saying, usury is itself a form of credit. In its bourgeoisified form, the form adapted to capital. In its pre-bourgeois form, it is rather the expression of lack of credit. In its capitalist form, it's going to be about surpluses of credit. But what he's suggesting here is that credit is not going to be parasitic. That credit is going to play a very important role in this whole kind of question of relation to the marketing of capital. So he summarizes on 536. Capital, he says, is now posited as not merely sustaining itself formally, but as realizing itself as value relating to itself as value in every one of the moments of its metamorphosis, in which it appears at one time as money, at another time as commodity, then again as exchange value, then again as use value. The passage from one moment to the other appears as a particular process, but each of these processes is the transition to the other. Capital is thus posited as value in process, which is capital in every moment. So value in process. That's what's going on here, and that's what he's summarizing here, back in this whole kind of diagram. We're going from the money and its value in process. So capital is what circulates, and it's the circulation process that's significant. It's not just capital as a thing. It is capital is now being defined as something that is circulating through these different moments, with production, of course, being a critical moment, but also realization being a critical moment. Now, this poses a very interesting kind of problem, which he addresses on 538-39. And we've already mentioned this, and we're going to go back to it, over it again. He says, first off, on 538, that capital travel, inasmuch as the circuits which capital travels in order to go from one of these forms into the other, constitute sections of circulation. And these sections are traveled in specific amounts of time. Okay, that's the time does it take to get to market. Even spatial distance reduces itself to time. This is what annihilation of space by time really refers to, which is the way distance is reduced to time. The important thing, for example, is not the market's distance in space, but the speed, the amount of time with which it can be reached. By that much, the velocity of circulation, the time in which it is accomplished, is a determinant of how many products can be produced in a given period of time, how often capital can be realized in a given period of time, how often it can reproduce and multiply its value. Thus, a moment enters into value determination, which indeed does not come out of the direct relation of labor to capital. Now, up until now, value has always been talked about as a direct relation of labor to capital. Labor cannot come from anywhere else. But here he says, there is a moment of value determination which does not come out of the direct relation of labor to capital. And that moment is the frequency with which the same capital can repeat the production process, creation of new value, in a given period of time, is evidently a condition not posited directly by the production process itself. Thus, while circulation does not itself produce a moment of value determination, that lies exclusively in labor, its speed does determine the speed with which the production process is repeated. Values are created. Thus, if not values, at least to a certain extent, the mass of values. In other words, if you have a certain amount of capital and it takes 1 year to go right the way through this process until it can get back into producing whatever it is you were producing, if it takes 1 year to do that, then the amount of value produced in the year is just that which is produced in one circulation time. What happens if you speed it all up and you can do it 4 times in a year? Well, in that case, the relationship between capital and labor remains constant in the production process, but you do it 4 times in a year. That is, you produce 4 times the amount of value, which you produced when you could only do it in 1 year. And if you can do it 20 times in a year, you can do it even more. So Marx is kind of saying, if you can speed up, then you can produce an increasing mass of value. And that speed up is not only about how fast you can go through production, it's how fast you can realize the value, how fast you can get it to market, how fast you can transform it back into money, capital, and get it back into the production process. So the speed of circulation plays a very important role in accelerating the mass of values. Now, how much of the history of capital has been about speed up? And how much has that speed up produced an increasing mass of values? One of the arguments that I'm often making is that the mass of values now is accelerating, and in part is accelerating because of this speed up. This is a very, very important proposition Marx is making here. And to the degree that actually speed up is one of the crucial features in the history of capitalism, we have to study the history of speed up, the history of turnover times, because that is where a lot of extra value is coming from, and the total value is expanding through this process. Now, if that is the case, then clearly technology is going to be very much directed towards accelerating turnover times, accomplishing speed up. Productive forces are not only going to be directed towards the technology of production, they're going to be very much directed towards this. When he kind of says, the important thing is not the market's distance in space, but the speed, the amount of time with which it can be reached, the velocity of circulation, the time at which it's accomplished. This is a determinant of how many products can be produced in a given period of time. Thus, a moment enters into value determination, which does not come directly out of labor-capital relation, but which is attached to this market process. So he says, thus, in addition to the labor time realized in production, the circulation time of capital enters in as a moment of value creation of productive labor time itself. While labor time appears as value positing activity, this circulation time of capital appears as the time of devaluation. That is, one of the things you're going to try and do is to mop up all of those periods when capital is not doing anything. In other words, if capital is defined as value in motion, any stoppage in the motion is a loss of capital. And that therefore, one of the things you want to do is to develop technologies which are going to actually stop that devaluation and get you through faster and faster. So he pushes this, that if the circulation time of capital were equal to 0, if the various stages of its transformations proceeded as rapidly in reality as in the mind, then that would likewise be the maximum of the factor by which the production process could be repeated. So the tendency to try to reduce circulation time is enormous. And he says on 539, circulation time is therefore not a positive value creating element, but if either surplus labor time or necessary labor time, or if production could proceed altogether without labor, then neither value nor capital nor value creation would exist. Circulation time therefore determines value only insofar as it appears as a natural barrier to the realization of labor time. It is therefore, in fact, a deduction from surplus labor time and increase of necessary labor time. Now, what's happening here is that there is this barrier of circulation time in general, and you're trying to reduce that barrier. And the more you reduce that barrier, the more you move into a society which is based on instantaneity, which is a very difficult society to imagine. And if it's totally instantaneous, then of course there's no point of value, there's no point of labor or anything. It's, you know, but there is, if you like, a tendency within capital to move towards instantaneity, which then leads Marx to say this. Circulation time, he says on bottom of 539, thus appears as a barrier to the productivity of labor, an increase in necessary labor time, a decrease in surplus labor time, a decrease in surplus value, and an obstruction, a barrier to the self-realization process of capital. Thus, while capital must on the one side strive to tear down every spatial barrier to intercourse, that is, overcoming space through time, i.e. to exchange, and to conquer the whole earth for its market, it strives on the other side to annihilate this space with time. It's not by time this time, it's with time. To annihilate this space with time. To reduce to a minimum the time spent in motion from one place to another. The more developed the capital, therefore, the more extensive the market over which it circulates, which forms the spatial orbit of its circulation. The more does it strive simultaneously for an even greater extension of the market and for greater annihilation of space by time, through time. If labor time is regarded not as the working day of the individual worker, but as the indefinite working day of an indefinite number of workers, then all relations of population come in here. The basic doctrines of population are therefore just as much contained in this first chapter on capital as those on profit, price, credit, etc. There appears here the universalizing tendency of capital, the abolition of spatial barriers, the reduction of the frictions of distance, and the substitution of spatial relations by temporal relations. This, he says, is the universalizing tendency of capital. This is what capital always does and has been doing from its very inception. And it's been doing it today. And we're witnessing some of the disadvantages of having done it today by the speed with which something like the coronavirus can move around the world. I mean, this is the negative side of what Marx is talking about here is right with us right now. As he says, although limited by its very nature, capital strives towards the universal development of the forces of production, and thus becomes the presupposition of a new mode of production, which is founded not on the development of the forces of production for the purposes of reproducing, or at most expanding a given condition, but where the free, unobstructed, progressive, and universal development of the forces of production is itself the presupposition of society, and hence of its reproduction. Where advance beyond the point of departure is the only presupposition. The tendency which capital possesses, but which at the same time, since capital is a limited form of production, contradicts it and hence drives it towards dissolution, distinguishes capital from all earlier modes of production, and at the same time contains this element that capital is posited as a mere point of transition. All previous forms of society, or what is the same of the forces of social production, founded on the development of wealth. Those thinkers of antiquity who was possessed of consciousness, therefore directly denounced wealth as a dissolution of the community. And then he goes into feudal life and dissolution of different forms of society, and how the development of science and under capital is also playing a very crucial role. And we're going to come back to that in a later section. In its, as he said, the development of science alone, i.e. the most solid form of wealth, both its product and its producer, was sufficient to dissolve these earlier communities. But the development of science, this ideal and at the same time practical wealth, is only one aspect, one form in which the development of human productive forces, i.e. of wealth, appears. Considered ideally, that is mentally, the dissolution of a given form of consciousness sufficed to kill a whole epoch. Interesting. The dissolution of a given form of consciousness sufficed to kill a whole epoch. Let's reverse that. That would mean if we wanted to kill capitalism, we would have to engage in the dissolution of its given form of consciousness. And that therefore the attack upon the consciousness that attaches to capital circulation and derives from capital circulation and derives from exchange, that consciousness is going to be one of the big barriers to the transition to socialism. Now, he's saying considered ideally. Of course, idealists would say, well, if we can change everybody's mind, then everything will change. No, that's not what Marx is saying. Marx is saying, however, that without the dissolution of the capitalist form of consciousness, the market form of consciousness, without a dissolution of that, we will never get to socialism. But the big question is, that's an idealistic position, and we know perfectly well that simply going around and arguing with everybody they should stop thinking like a capitalist and should think like a socialist ain't going to work. It's not going to work. Because actually daily life and material circumstances are such as to produce and reinforce and reconstitute a capitalist consciousness. In other words, our way of life is about that consciousness and producing that consciousness. So we cannot change that consciousness without changing the way of life. And we can't change the way of life without changing our consciousness. This is Marx's dialectic at work. But I love this phrase, that a given form of consciousness sufficed to kill a whole epoch. And it was capitalist consciousness that destroyed what feudalism was about. But it was also capitalist practices which allowed that consciousness to function and produce that consciousness. And one of those forms of consciousness which dissolved the preceding order was science. Now, it's interesting that science is now under attack for all kinds of reasons, most of them bad, as we understand, but the fact that there's a question mark over the consciousness that derives from certain kinds of scientific understanding. And in particular, I would argue, the consciousness that derives from the kind of understanding that economists offer us is part and parcel of our problem. In other words, we have to dissolve the scientific knowledge of the economists in exactly the same way that the economists dissolved the ways of thinking of late feudalism. And this, it seems to me, is what Marx is putting on the agenda. So this is what Marx is beginning to look at, and looks at it in more and more detail, and then starts to sort of have some general discussions about circulation times, about the kind of question of transport, communication is constantly coming back in, the question of the notion of space and time, all these kinds of issues are coming back in. And so on 542, Marx kind of say that we should start to look at the basis of the possibility of universal development of the individual and the real development of individuals on the basis as a constant suspension of the barriers which exist through through circulation. And we have to recognize that these barriers, he said, are not sacred limits. And he puts it this way: not an ideal or imagined universality of the individual, but the universality of his real and ideal relations. Hence also the grasping of his own history as a process. I've made this argument before that Marx is terribly committed to the idea that we should understand our lives as a process, that we are not things, we are, we live a process, and that process is from that we derive our understandings and our consciousness and all the rest of it. And therefore, to understand the nature of the process is in some part to understand where we get our ideas from, and to some degree who we are. And he then goes on to say we have to understand our own history as a process and recognize nature equally present as a practical power as his real body. That is, we are not separated from nature, we are integral to nature, and that therefore the dialectic of our positionality in relation to nature is important. For this, he says, however, necessary above all, that the full development of the forces of production has become the condition of production. And therefore, conditions of production are posited as a limit to the development of the productive forces. If we now return, he says, to the circulation time of capital, then its abbreviation, except for development of the means of communication and transport required, is in part the creation of a continuous and hence an ever more extensive market, and in part the development of economic relations, development of forms of capital by means of which it artificially abbreviates the circulation time. It may be further remarked that since capital alone possesses the conditions of the production of capital, hence satisfies and strives to realize them, it is a general tendency of capital at all points, which are presuppositions of circulation, which form its productive centers, to assimilate them, to assimilate these points into itself, i.e. to transform them into capitalizing production or production of capital. And he's talking here about production based on capital, coming out of circulation, dominating production, and then flowing back into the circulation process to reconfigure circulation. So in a sense, the way I look at this is really talking about the production of globalization. It's talking about the production of more and more extended markets. And as you have more and more extended markets, so this feeds back in terms of new capacities of production, new modes of production, new forms of production. So that the system, for me anyway, is a very geographical kind of system. And we're seeing the conquest of space and the circulation of capital in space and time, with space and time themselves being reconfigured according to the measurements of cost and the measurement of temporality and so on. So this is, if you like, much of the argument that is taking place here. Coming back, however, to one very important issue. It follows, he says on 544, from the relation of circulation time to the production process, that the sum of values produced, or the total realization of capital in a given epoch, is determined not simply by the new value which it creates in the production process, or by the surplus time realized in the production process, but rather by this surplus time, surplus value, multiplied by the number which expresses how often the production process of capital can be repeated within a given period of time. The number which expresses this frequency of repetition may be regarded as the coefficient of the production process, or of the surplus value created through it. So the number of times and the speed up then is expressed as a coefficient of value production. and the faster the speed up, how that coefficient then change. So this explains a lot about how the productive forces of capital get oriented towards the reduction of circulation time, how they are taken up with overcoming these blank spaces where nothing is happening, reducing what he later on will call fallow time or devaluation time. So, and reducing all these barriers to the continuity of the production process. So you've got these propositions now saying capital is constantly working towards the maintenance of its continuity and continuity of its production, and that continuity is something that can only be assured by a smooth transition from one form, such as money, into commodity, into production, into commodity, the smoothness of all of that, and the time it takes to do all of that, and the temporalities have to be brought together, and the conflicting temporalities, and those conflicting temporalities, he says, eventually will be resolved to some degree by a creative role of the credit system, which will smooth out many of these differentiations. So that the maintenance of the continuity of the production process becomes a necessity, and that continuity and the speed up of that continuity also becomes a necessity within the history of capital. And one of the things this does is to overcome the dead time of capital. He talks on 548 about instead of lying fallow, the surplus value can be animated and the surplus value can be generated. And that a lot of what we're doing is to try to eliminate the porosity that exists within the capital of circulation and so on. So he mentioned some of this together on 548. So that and again at the top he talks about the problem of capital lying fallow and how we have to find ways to recuperate that. At the bottom, he talks about the continuity of the production process. Production presupposes that circulation time has been suspended, and that the tendency is therefore to try to reduce it to reduce the phases of circulation, including production, to as close to zero. And he uses an interesting metaphor at the bottom where he kind of says, you know, capital must spend some time as a cocoon before it can take off as a butterfly. And when I talk about the different geographical mobilities of capital, I would say, you know, production capital is the cocoon, which is pretty stationary. Commodity capital is like the caterpillar, it kind of crawls around and moves around. When capital becomes the money form, it becomes the butterfly form. So I think this is a nice metaphor to sort of talk about the different mobilities of capital, but also to talk about how those different forms of capital can handle spatiotemporality. The butterfly form can flit around the world, so money capital can flit around the world pretty fast, light on something for a while, withdraw from it. So the butterfly form of capital, which is one which is very much evident in contemporary capitalism, contrasts with the sort of slower movement of the commodity form, which contrasts with the very, very difficult to move part, which is the productive part, the productive moment of capital. So when you go through these different moments, you find different ways in which space and time get set up. So this is, in effect, what we're dealing with in this week's thing. Now, what then follows are some interesting things, and which I'm not going to go through because, as you know, Marx gets a lot of his ideas out of critical investigation and interrogation of classical political economy. What follows on all of this is a detailed discussion of Ricardo and why Ricardo got certain things right and certain things wrong. There's discussion of Malthus, there's discussion of Carey, there's a discussion of Cherbuliez and Sismondi. So there are discussions of all of these different characters at different times. And I think it's worthwhile reading and studying, but what you get out of it will deepen your appreciation of how Marx interrogated classical political economy and built a lot of his theory out of that interrogation. There is one issue that does crop up here, which has not been discussed very much. And I think that I would like to mention this. And that is on page 552. Marx mentions the whole kind of question of competition. Now, competition is something which is a very important issue, but Marx tends not to handle it very thoroughly or very well. So I think it's important to look at those little flashes where he brings up the question of competition, and he does so on 552. Competition generally, he says, this essential locomotive force of the bourgeois economy. But then he adds, competition does not establish its laws, but is rather their executor. Unlimited competition is therefore not the presupposition for the truth of the economic laws, but rather the consequence, the form of appearance in which their necessity realizes itself. As a bit further down the line, he says, competition, therefore, does not explain these laws, rather it lets them be seen, but does not produce them. So competition comes back in Marx's theory all of the time as the enforcer of the laws of motion of capital. But it does not explain the laws of motion of capital. They have to be, those laws of motion of capital have to be explained a different way. We've seen some of that at work already in this whole kind of question of spatio-temporality and the building of infrastructures and so on. Competition is not going to explain why all of that happens. That is going to be explained by something else. But if we want to explain how those laws get enforced and how infrastructures get actually built, so on, then competition comes into the story. And, you know, and therefore it's the enforcer, which raises an interesting question, which I think to some degree Marx begs in much of his work, which is, if the enforcer goes to sleep, what happens to the laws? I mean, the laws can't, there are constitutions which mandate all kinds of things, but if nobody's enforcing the constitutional mandates, the Constitution is a dead letter. So you need an enforcement mechanism. The enforcement mechanism is one of them is competition. It's an important enforcement mechanism. But if there is no competition and there's monopoly power, or competition gets restructured in some way, then the laws of motion are not going to work very well. And in fact, you may end up with rather different laws of motion. For example, competition over the equalization of the rate of profit. This competition was very much blunted during the Bretton Woods era, because each nation state was in a sense an entity working with its own fiscal policy. And to the degree it worked with its own fiscal policies, competition was limited to competition within the United States or within Britain or within France, and competition between the United States and France and Germany and Korea and China and the rest of it was muted. We've moved from a situation where there was very little competition internationally in the 1960s to a situation where 1980s, 1990s, international competition has become very powerful and very strong. So this is something which we need to recognize, and Marx brings it back in again. It's obviously on his mind on 559, where he says here, before we go further, this is about okay, right to the bottom he makes this argument. This means, in other words, nothing other than that the laws of capital are completely realized only within unlimited competition and industrial production. Now, this is a very important thing about Marx's theory. Marx is working towards a theory of what happens under conditions of unlimited competition and industrial production. What happens when you don't have unlimited competition, but you've got oligopoly or monopoly or whatever? And what happens when you're not simply dealing with industrial production, you're dealing with, say, real estate development or something of that kind? Then goes on to say, capital develops adequately on the latter productive basis and in the former relation of production, i.e. its immanent laws enter completely into reality. Since this is so, it would have to be shown that this unlimited competition and industrial production are conditions of the realization of capital, conditions which it must itself, little by little, produce, instead of the hypothesis appearing here as merely that of the theoretician. And Marx is kind of saying here, okay, I've been working on a theory which is in effect based on unlimited competition and industrial production. To what degree are we living in a world of unlimited competition and industrial production? And I think the answer is that at certain historical periods have been more competitive than others. At other points, we've been in a system of monopoly capitalism. Are we now back in the system of monopoly capitalism? I think the argument is very strong that we are no longer as much constrained by unlimited competition. And we're certainly having to look at other forms of circulation of capital than that which is involved in Marx's descriptions here, which is that of industrial capital. And I think we need to take that into account and I think be bitterly grateful to Marx for pointing this out, that the presupposition that he is basing all this on is unlimited competition and the circulation of industrial capital. Now, I have no objection to him developing everything that goes on in that world into a kind of a theoretical understanding, and I think certain critical understandings come out of that. But we have to recognize that that is a theoretical position. It's an idealist position, and we have to ask the question: is it exactly the same as that which we would want to accept? So the rest of this section is really about Marx's discussion with all of the classical political economists. And like I say to you, it's worthwhile working through this if you can and care about it. I'm not going to do it because you will find a great deal of of material here that is interesting. So let me see how much time you got. Okay, I've got a little bit more time. Now, Marx, towards the end of the sections that I gave you, right the way through to the end of this, to 594, I'm actually going to skip most of this, apart from a couple of remarks, and then I'll go back to look at some other things. On 585, Marx comes back to something which I think is an echo of the argument much earlier. And that is this, that he's going to look at the productive powers which actually derive from labor, and he's going to sort of, because they're alienated productive powers, and then there's an alienation involved, they get transferred and transformed into something different. And here he comes back to talk about this. Like all productive powers of labor, i.e. those which determine the degree of its intensity and hence its extensive realization, the association of the workers, the cooperation and division of labor as fundamental conditions of the productivity of labor, that the association appears as the productive power of capital. The collective power of labor, its character as social labor, is therefore the collective power of capital. Likewise science, likewise the division of labor, as it appears as division of the occupations and of exchange corresponding to them. All social powers of production are productive powers of capital, and it appears as itself their subject. Now, this is coming back again and again to this kind of question of alienation, that labor actually creates capital through the production of surplus value. It cannot get access to its necessary labor, to its own forms of sustenance. It cannot get access to that without actually producing surplus value for the capitalist. That is, a condition of labor's existing is that it produce surplus value, which is the production of capital. Capital, at the same time, uses its power of domination over labor to reorganize the production process, do all of these things like productive forces, transform productive forces and the like, and to do and create all sorts of forms of association of the laborer, and to do all of these things. And then it looks around and says, I built this world. This world is my construction. The laborers have no part of it. And they have been alienated. And that alienated labor at the base of the system is not able to actually exert any kind of power over this system. And again, these are the sorts of metaphors which are around. Since I'm on lockdown, I've been sort of binging a bit on Netflix. And actually, a very interesting metaphor for all of this is Westworld. I mean, Westworld is the creation of a fantasy land by human beings who create human beings or fake human beings who can be shot and killed and then rebuilt and sent back out again around certain kind of narratives and so on, which are supplied by the designers of this park. But of course, the story rests on the fact that the appearance is that all of the power lies with the human beings who've designed the system, and they therefore assert their powers all of the time. Meanwhile, it appears that the hosts of the people who kind of suffer being raped and killed, and dreadful things happening to them, they have no power whatsoever. And of course, the whole story of Westworld is how certain elements within that powerless world start to assert power and start to turn the tables, and so there gets an inversion. So what Marx is doing here is to just sort of say that these productive powers that appear to belong to capital actually don't belong to capital. They are powers of labor. And if labor becomes conscious of its powers, it can start actually then to utilize those powers in radically different ways. And this is, I think, a very important kind of mode of thinking, which I think it's worthwhile looking at. And Marx starts to sort of talk about the being of the workers and how the being and the being of capital and what that contest is about. And remember, they are locked in each other's arms in this mortal combat. And we look at some of the lopsidedness in the relation between the two. as Marx kind of says on the bottom of 585, there cannot be one capitalist for every worker, but rather there has to be a certain quantity of workers per capitalist, not like one or two journeymen per master. Productive capital, or the mode of production corresponding to capital, can be present in only two forms: manufacture and large-scale industry. In the former, the division of labor is predominant. In the second, the combination of labor powers with a regular mode of work and the employment of scientific power, where the combination and, so to speak, the communal spirit of labor is transferred to the machine. In the first situation, the mass of accumulated workers must be large in relation to the amount of capital. In the second, the fixed capital must be large in relationship to the number of many cooperating workers. But the concentration of many and their distribution among the machinery as so many cogs, why it is so different in agriculture does not belong here, is, however, already presupposed. So the existence of concentration and what happens in the manufacturing system of production, which is the subject of one of the chapters in Capital, which is then followed by the factory system, which is capital's preferred mode of operation. And this leads him to say, at the bottom of 587, the principle of developed capital is precisely to make special skills superfluous and to make manual work, directly physical labor, generally superfluous, both as skill and as muscular exertion. To transfer skill, rather, into the dead forces of nature, that is, into the machine. And this machine technology is going to be a very important item in what follows. But then, just jumping, an interesting observation on page 590, which is the main point right towards the end of this whole section that we've been reading, where Marx kind of makes the following comment: but only capital has subjugated historical progress to the service of wealth. Now, remember, back on page 488, when Marx talked about wealth and how the wealth is hollowed out and has no meaning, and that the pursuit of wealth has no meaning. And I would want to draw your attention again to something which Marx does mention in here, and which I didn't talk about, but which is important, which is back on page 541, where Marx says this, when he's talking about the wilting after flowering and as consequence of the flowering. This is the point at which it is itself worked out, developed into the form in which it is compatible with the highest development of the forces of production, hence also the richest development of the individuals. Now, Marx throughout, and I'm always coming back to this because it's so, completely misunderstood, and probably will never be properly understood by the right wing anyway, is that Marx is always in favor of the richest development of the individuals. And that the problem right now is that historical progress has been subjugated to the service of wealth. And there's a big difference between saying we want a society which is wealthy and where wealth is everywhere in evidence, which is the kind of society we've built, which is radically different in Marx's view from that society in which there is the possibility for the richest development of the individuals. The richest development of the individuals cannot arise in a society where the imprisonment in wage labor, the existence of debt peonage, the general alienation of whole segments of the population from both the experience of work and daily life, cultural forms and politics. We can't imagine a society where that world is the end point of what the wealth is about. I mean, in effect, we've created a world in the pursuit of wealth where some people are astonishingly wealthy. But those people are astonishingly wealthy because, as Marx kind of says in that passage, those passages, the poverty of the laborer becomes exceedingly gross. So the poverty of the worker is what allows for the production of that wealth. And if that is the case, then this does not allow for the full development of the individuals and the workers in particular. Certain individuals may say, oh, well, it's great for me, but it's not great for everyone. And I think what Marx is posing here is this grand contradiction between a bourgeois mode of production, which in itself is about the development of the productive forces for all the reasons we're talking about. The construction of a universalism, which is potentially progressive and potentially not only progressive, but which covers basic needs in the minimum of time. All of those things can go on, which would liberate all individuals to explore their own potentialities with any way they liked. And again, here too, we come back to this issue of space and time, that the kind of temporality of all of this and the speed up that's involved in all of this is not necessarily beneficial to the exploration of all possibilities. In fact, the speed up, where we're looking for faster and faster modes of consumption, have led us into this contemporary world of the production of needs which are about instantaneous gratifications and experiential forms of consumerism which don't last. And what we're seeing right now, thanks to the virus, is the exposition of what happens to a society where capital accumulation is about the acceleration of experiential forms of consumerism, which involve, for example, tourism and all of those sectors which are made superbly in trouble. The only form of society which is actually doing quite well right now would of course be the Netflix society, because to the degree we're all locked down, I'm at least watching more Netflix because I have nothing better to do apart from reading stuff and working on stuff. But for entertainment, I have very little I can do apart from watching Netflix series. So welcome to Netflix in the age of COVID-19. So here's where it seems to me that Marx has been headed. But all of this stuff on space and time, to me, as you can imagine, been absolutely crucial. I could never have written many of the things I've written had it not been for these passages about space and time, which Marx is investigating here. And his very clear exposition as to why it is that capital must conquer both space and time in a certain kind of way and reconfigure spatio-temporalities in certain ways, engage in processes of what I call time-space compression, and we can elaborate upon many of these ideas and elaborate also on how infrastructures get built, how the importance of the infrastructures and what these infrastructures might be about, who might build them, how they might get built, how they might get priced, how they might be handled in terms of economic theory. And Marx telling us basically we should handle them as if they are part of the world of fixed capital. And that world of fixed capital is very soon going to be part and parcel very much of what it is we have to say. Well, I'm going to stop here. I guess we're getting a little close to the end of the time. I'm not sure how I can do questions, and if any questions can get through, I'm not sure. I don't know. Let me see if anybody can get in and ask questions.
For a few seconds, see if she can come back.
Okay, I hear something.
Hi, everybody. So, Professor Harvey, we have a question. One of the questions is, I am very interested in this dialectic between capitalist consciousness and practice. As I understand it, it suggests that for transformation to happen, there needs to be some kind of hiccup in one or the other, or maybe both. Would you speak a bit to where the possibilities for change works in your reading of Marx?
I think his argument here, just, I mean, the simplest argument is simply to say this, that there is a certain consciousness that arises out of acts of exchange and the addiction to money power, and that consciousness arises out of certain practices. I have money power, and I can go into the market and I can do all kinds of things with it, and I can purchase privileges and so on, and if that can be a way in which I can purchase my own privileges, then I'm going to want for the continuation of this society, which produces a situation in which I can command money power, which gives me command over services, which gives me command over large segments of social and even political life. So it's out of those practices that certain consciousness arises. Now, there can be critique of those practices. And I think that, even many capitalists will recognize that there's something empty and hollow about the perpetual pursuit of wealth, as opposed to the pursuit of a kind of social order where all individuals have the possibility of exploring their own possibilities and creative instincts in whatever ways they want. So I think what Marx is trying to say to us is that there is a moment of consciousness which is in itself free to think and be concerned, and that's what a lot of literature, of course, is about, and a lot of art is about, which is sort of exploring alternatives. But those alternatives always come up against the hard realities of how we're going to change daily life, where I go into a supermarket and I'm going to be confronted with the products of alienated labor, and I'm going to hold in my hand money power, which is alienated labor as well, and I'm going to use those things in an alienated way. So how am I going to get out of the practice of that? So I think what Marx's position is that you have to work on all fronts. That there is a moment where he kind of says that ideas can be a material force in historical change, and they can be, but on their own they will not go very far without radical transformations in practices. And I think a lot of people in political movements recognize that very well. A lot of people in the environmental movement will say, for example, look, it's all very well, you advocating for the Green New Deal, but all the time you continue to drive that gas-guzzling SUV around and put all those miles on, and all the time you hop into planes and all the rest of it, which, by the way, we can't do right now, which is something that's very beneficial for the environment. And by the way, in Wuhan, I think air quality has improved remarkably as a result of this. The changing behaviors which have been mandated by the arrival of this virus. So it is difficult to envisage some sort of dramatic revolutionary change in practices without there being a change of consciousness, and it's similarly impossible to think about changes of consciousness which don't involve serious changes in the nature of our actual daily practices. So that is the way in which I think Marx sets it up. But there are other issues as well, because our daily practices are also embedded in institutional arrangements. They're also embedded in certain technological configurations, which to some degree play a role in fixing our social relations and the nature of our social relations. So as I see it, my own view would be, if I take all of Marx's thinking, I would say you need changes in technology, changes in the relation to nature, changes in institutions, changes in consciousness, changes in production practices, changes in forms. So we need to change on many different fronts. And people look at you and say, well, that's pretty impossible. But actually, when I think about it, I think, well, no, it's not so impossible, because I remember a time in 1970 when we thought about the world in a rather different way than we think about it now. How do we think about it now? Well, we've had 40 odd years, 50 odd years almost of neoliberal ethic. And we now think of the world in rather neoliberal terms, and we didn't think of the world in those neoliberal terms in 1970s. We thought about them in different ways. So we've changed our consciousness and our mode of thought. We're much more into these days personal responsibility, personal entrepreneurialism of the self, or those kinds of neoliberal things, which were not there in the late 1960s, 1970s. People were thinking in terms of class solidarities. They were thinking of political movements. The idea of communism was important. The idea of socialist future was important. And I remember in the 1970s actually really believing that revolution was around the corner. Well, it was around the corner. It's just that it was a neoliberal revolution, not the socialist revolution. But when you kind of say to yourself, well, how has the world changed through this rise of neoliberalism? And I think there are some fantastic books about that. For instance, if you take the book of Melinda Cooper on family values, a very, very interesting book, which is about how the family was construed during the Fordist period of the 1960s and 1970s, and how family has been reconfigured through 30 or 40 years of neoliberal policies and politics and ideological manipulation and all the rest of it. So in other words, if we look at institutional arrangements, and if we look at relation to nature, and we look at all those things, there's been the whole neoliberal era was a real transformation. In some ways, it was a counter-revolutionary movement where all of these elements I'm talking about were shifting and changing, and brought us to the point now where it's hard to think in any way that is not inflected by neoliberal thinking. I mean, we're all neoliberals now without knowing it, and to some degree, a critique of that is not about going back to the way we've thought and felt in the 1970s, because that's not the point. But can we actually envisage some sort of transformation which was analogous to how neoliberalism arose out of the kind of the Bretton Woods, Fordist kind of world, how that transformation occurred? Can we envisage a transformation of the neoliberal world into something very different? And it's going to require different behaviors, which is why I think there is an element in this virus shock where we're all having to change our behaviors. We're all having to think differently, not necessarily in positive ways, I have to say. It won't necessarily be that way, but we're all having to do something different. Is this a moment when we can actually start to think about, okay, are there radical differences in behavior that need to be constructed? Can we construct them? If so, how shall they be constructed? So this is a positionality moment where we can start to ask those questions. And I think that for me anyway, living in isolation and seclusion here, I'm going to pretty much try to think out some of those things.
Thank you, Professor. Another question that we have is, in regards of transportation, can we think of a railroad as a factory whose commodity is transport? If so, would this extend to roads and even internet connection infrastructure?
I wouldn't want to do it that way. I think that the way Marx does it is adequate, which is to say we should think of the railroad not as a factory, but as a particular mode of production. And Marx does allow. I mean, Marx uses the word mode of production in different settings. For instance, he'll talk about the mode of production of steel, which is a very distinctive mode of production. The mode of production in agriculture is different from the mode of production in steel, even though they're both embedded in the, quote, capitalist mode of production, which is the totality. So when Marx is using the narrow term mode of production, it's about specific modes of production in different spheres of action and activity. And I think that I would therefore want to say, let's look at the distinctive mode of production of transport and communications, and let's look at the particular kinds of features. One of the features of the mode of production is that you're always dealing with what Adam Smith called natural monopolies. If you build a railroad, it's very hard to imagine there should be 50 different railroads competing with each other running between, say, New York and Washington. You're therefore dealing with one railroad, and the big question is, well, if it's monopoly, how do you price the railroad? Same would apply to toll roads. It's not as if you have 5 different toll roads running, and you can choose which one, and they're going to compete with each other on pricing. So we've got a particular mode of production of transport and communications, where there are monopoly elements, or there are certain technologies, and there have been some crazy solutions. For example, like in Britain, they have a separate corporation that runs the track, and then different companies bid for spaces on the track. So it's an insane system. And most people in Britain would want to go back to a single kind of monopoly, state administered or state mandated structure. So I think the way you would do it, and then also within it, you would also say what kind of social relations are there within this mode of production. In the same way, there are distinctive modes of social relations in agriculture, which often involves migrant labor forces, and the seasonality, the strong seasonality which exists in certain arenas of agricultural production, which don't exist in other areas. So I think the way I would do it is to say, let's look at the distinctive mode of production of transport and communications. Let's look at how innovations are introduced and utilized, how the revolutions in productive forces are set up and within this sphere. So we just want it to be discussed as a distinctive mode of production, in the same way that Marx says agriculture is different from steel, and steel is different from the production of, say, Netflix original.
Thank you, Professor. I think that's about the time we have today. Could you let us know what to prepare for next week?
Oh, yeah, next week is, oh my goodness, we're going to be into the thick of some fantastic stuff next week. It's going to be 516 to 594. I think that's right, is it? Or have I got that wrong? No. Oh, no, yeah, I've got that wrong. You've already done that. It's yeah, it's 595 to 668. Let me check that. Yeah, 595. Yeah, 595 to 668. Okay. So thank you, everybody. See you next week.